Dr. King would have loved that video. To all the children who participated in that, just know that you are living part of his dream, what he hoped and dreamed and knew would come. You are an example of that coming to life in our times. We were looking for somebody to come speak to this congregation on this historic week when we will install a new president shortly after an unbelievable, still hard to reckon with insurrection at the Capitol in Washington, D.C., and my good friend Bishop Carlton Pearson was able to ask an old friend of his, the US Congress Representative Jessie Jackson Jr., who served from 1995 to 2012 in the US Congress, to come speak to us. Of course, his father was there with Martin Luther King Jr. throughout his ministry and at the very moment of his assassination. So he comes with poignant words for us today, and I'd like to ask Bishop Pearson to introduce him to us.
Thank you, Pastor Marlin. In the nearly 15 years that I've been affiliated with this church, I have observed and absorbed the dream is still alive. I don't know of a predominantly non-black church that would spend this much time, or does spend this much time, celebrating Dr. King, social justice issues that relate to the African-American community. And this is what this church has done for years. That's why we are affiliated with it and so strongly committed to it. To have my friend Jessie Jackson Jr. come today is a high moment and a high honor for me and for this ministry, this church, this community. The name Jessie Jackson is like royalty when it comes to the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, without question, other than the King children themselves. This one family have carried on the legacy in unbelievable ways. Jessie Jr. is brilliant, intelligent, a historian. He's a theologian. He's spiritual. He's our friend, and he's going to be with us today, and you're going to love every moment of the conversation we had so lucidly with him just this week and today. It's going to really minister to a lot of people. So welcome, Jessie Jackson Jr., to the All Souls Unitarian Church and to our wonderful family throughout the planet. So happy to have you today.
We're delighted to have Representative Jessie Jackson Jr. with us today at All Souls. We've been thinking about you a lot because of the relationship you've had in Congress from 1995 to 2012 and all the work that you've done in Washington, D.C. in light of everything that happened last week. How you're feeling about everything that's going on in our country. Here we are on Martin Luther King Day weekend, and all of this has been happening in our capital and in our country. What are you thinking about right now?
First, Pastor, let me begin by thanking you and All Souls for being kind enough to allow me the privilege of addressing you during this holiday period. I also want to thank Bishop Pearson for his faith and his confidence in me. This has been a very, very difficult week for me personally. It's been a very difficult period for our entire nation. And the level of division and acrimony is only complicated by the national health concerns associated with the plague that we've all experienced. And so Dr. King, in this particular context, I believe comes into a particular focus, where we would turn to each other and not on each other, and recognize our commonness as citizens, but also recognize our commonness as children of the one true God of human history. And so I am honored to be here. I'm saddened by what is taking place in our country.
I want you to tell me just what you think is the next step once this settles, even the pandemic settles, and we get a new president, a new administration. What does the country, in your opinion, have to look forward to that's different than not only the past but the past 400 years?
Repentance. We've got a path that is set out for us, repentance, for me to acknowledge that there are mistakes in my life personally, to recognize that there are mistakes in our corporate lives as Americans, whether we are North and South, liberal and conservative, Democrat and Republican. We're going to have to come to each other with a sense of a shared acceptance of our own shame, the blame that each of us individually and collectively have brought to the table that has brought us to this point. We're going to have to own the guilt that is associated with our behavior on both sides of the divide. We're going to have to seek forgiveness on a scale that we probably haven't seen since the ministry around the Sea of Galilee nearly 2,000 years ago. In fact, there are many, many more Americans today who are caught up in this moment than existed around the Sea of Galilee that is responsible for so many of the stories of our common sense of morality. After that we can move to the area of redemption and then restoration, and then hopefully return to the path of building a more perfect union for all Americans that leaves no one behind. I think that's what's next.
That's so beautifully said. There are people calling for unity right now in Washington, D.C., but the unity that they're calling for seems to want to escape what you were saying, which is the truth telling and the need for forgiveness and redemption in this moment. And I'm just curious, you use religious language. I'm curious from your standpoint, how is religion a resource for us in this moment? Because religion, the Proud Boys, as I've been reading, kneeled down to pray to Jesus before they stormed the Capitol.
You know, I was raised on the south side of Chicago in a deeply held African-American Trinitarian religious tradition. I was baptized by the late Reverend Clay Evans of the Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church. And I've had the privilege of working with my father, who is a deep part, an integral part of the historic African-American National Baptist Convention. And then I served in Congress for 17 years, where I maintained my faith. But it wasn't until my shortcomings, when the errors of my ways became public, and I, like Saul of Tarsus, fell off of my horse and hit my head, and I spent 30 months in a federal prison. And I looked at the ramifications of my behavior for not only my wife and now my ex-wife, but its ramifications for my children, for my parents, for my community, for the broader society. And I made a determination that I have to give something back, even beyond the 17 years of service. And that took me through a spiritual journey. I literally transitioned from Trinitarianism to a constructive kind of deism, to reconstruct my thinking and my faith. And that moved me to a providential, if you will, a providential theism, and all of it driven by the idea that I have an obligation and a relationship that each of us does, first and foremost, with the one true God of human history. And that led me to a universalism. And so I know the path I believe forward that all of us are going to have to go through. It's going to unfold one way or the other. It will be shallow calls for unity, or it will be the rebirth of All Souls and the rebirth of the ministry of Bishop Pearson, which will recognize a universal appeal that there is a step and a process that we follow. And it includes repentance and acceptance for the responsibility of our behavior, no matter how big it was or how small it was, how we contributed either directly or indirectly, how we contributed by not speaking up when we should have, and how we contributed by being silent when we should have spoken. And that's going to lead for a listening ear towards the idea that maybe I've done something, no matter how many small, that has contributed to the division. And that recognition requires an honesty. Are you willing to forgive me for the role that I have played in creating the division? The honesty associated with that dialogue will lead, I believe, to hopefully a mutual shared need to forgive. And then we're going to redeem each other, I hope, and then ultimately move on and focus upon the need and the desire, I think, that all of us have to ensure that our children grow up in an even better world than the one in which we found. I don't think we can ask much more of each other than that. And I think we will do all of this over the watchful eye and with the watchful eye of providence.
Oh, beautiful. I know we spoke earlier about you spending some time well in Washington, D.C., attending All Souls Unitarian Church there as you were in this period of spiritual exploration around universalism. And we also talked about how Dr. King and Coretta Scott King, in their years in Boston, spent time attending Unitarian churches there. And Dr. King, and we heard Coretta say this at one point later on, said, we loved the Unitarian Church and we felt very at home there. However, Martin realized, quoting her, Martin realized that in order to build a mass movement of Black people in this country, he needed to go back and be sure to do that from a Trinitarian Christian context. And I'd just be curious about your reflection on that.
I think Dr. King was twixt in between the idea of reason, the idea of logic, and the philosophy associated with his personal relationship with God, which he absolutely found in Unitarianism. I overwhelmingly identify with that. And then there is the tradition of Muslims who had been introduced to Christianity, who stony the road we trod, bitter the chastening rod, who experienced the long nadir of American slavery, and who relied upon Jesus the Christ as a sole protector in the dreariest and the darkest days of our nation's history. The Unitarianism calls us to action in the present. The Trinitarianism, oftentimes uncritical, without the liberation theological component that would lead us to free ourselves from our condition, with the help of the Unitarian, someone willing to act in the present, was all the difference in the world in terms of the complexity, in part of the complexity of our freedom. And so what makes Bishop Pearson so fascinating to me is that his ministry, when he came to Chicago, was challenging all of the historic orthodoxy of the way in which we were raised, the way in which we were taught. And Bishop Pearson, I don't think, quite frankly, we were ready for it. But truth crushed to the earth has a way of coming full circle again. And now we emerge with some of the most prophetic thinking and some of the most prophetic teaching coming from a synthesis of theological teachings that in part All Souls clearly represents, but can also be found in the teachings of Bishop Carlton Pearson.
Thank you for those kind words, Jesse. You spoke of you used the word repentance, which literally means to rethink or to reconsider, or after you have thought, think again. And what I see as occurring in the universe today is the universe is correcting itself. And we have to ask ourselves as a nation and as individuals, why do we believe it? And how do those beliefs add to or subtract from the quality of our life or the quality of how we experience ourselves as the living? The nation is being forced to reconsider itself. Everything that has happened has exposed what ultimately needs to be expelled from this country, its character, its consciousness, possibly even its Congress. The way we've been operating as a nation for several hundred years served a purpose, but didn't fulfill the ultimate purpose, which is the unification of the human race. And we're being forced, and some are having to fight to get their own old thoughts. You are one of the voices of this generation, and one of the choices, whether you know it or not, of this generation to be part of that profound leadership. Everything that has happened to you or us or any of us is all summing up to where we're going from here. We're being gifted, awarded, equipped, educated with the kind of mental technologies and spiritual equipment to make the world, to not only make a difference in the world, but to make the world different. We need you. We need your voice. We need your head. We need your heart. I'm so glad you came to us today.
I want to follow up with a question about there was this confusion of symbols around the Capitol during last Wednesday's events. You had Confederate flags, you had Christian crosses, some of which had the president's name written on them. You had all kinds of symbols of Christianity, as well as nooses, as well as swastikas and anti-Semitic and other racist symbolism. What can we make of this? And I guess I'm particularly interested in the fact that white not just evangelical Christianity, although there's a strong strain in there, but also in some white mainline churches, even some white Catholic churches, we have this ongoing, from going back to slavery to today, this ongoing white supremacist or racist component. Is there a way that we can separate white Christianity from racism and redeem white Christianity in this day and age?
There may be a day that we can only pray that 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, we're not divided by race or by class or by orientation, and that our church can come together and recognize that we are one single body. What I can tell you is, when I was elected to Congress in 1995, in the middle of the contract for America with Newt Gingrich, maybe it's my orientation and maybe it's the family that I grew up in, but I took 5 years of my initial 17 years of service and I documented these symbols. So just last week, the statue of Robert E. Lee, sent to the United States Capitol by the people of Virginia, was withdrawn because of complaints by African American lawmakers, including myself, who said this symbol of anti-union doesn't belong here. It is a symbol that has honor in some category, in some quarters, but is a hostile work environment for people of color who have been elected long after the state of Virginia made the decision to send his statue there. The state of Alabama, General Wheeler's statue, not far from Rosa Parks's statue in Statuary Hall. He is donning his Confederate uniform, sent to the Capitol of the United States as a symbol of resistance, and he is one of two statues in the Capitol of the United States still wearing his CSA, Confederate States of America belt buckle. This past week, we elected an African American and a Jewish American from the state of Georgia to the United States Senate. When they get there, and at this hour they have not been sworn in yet, they're going to see the statue from Georgia of Alexander Hamilton Stevens. And on that statue, it will say, Vice President of the Confederacy. Now imagine in 2021 that one of the fights that the two newest senators in the United States will have to wage is the removal of that statue and encouraging the people of Georgia to consider another luminary that is more responsive and more reflective of who Georgia is becoming. I say that to say that when the Confederate flag showed up during the insurrection, and when the nooses showed up during the insurrection, and that when the swastikas and anti-Semitic symbols showed up during the insurrection, these symbols are not new to the Capitol. They are in the Capitol, and they are also in our politics. They are in our spirit. They are in the words that the legislators use to mask how they really feel and how their constituents really feel about no longer fighting on a battlefield called civil war, but politics on the floor of Congress and politics in the United States Senate. I believe it was von Clausewitz who said, politics is war by other means. What is occurring right now, which Bishop Pearson, I think, picked up on correctly, is the unmasking that behind the language is a broad cross-section of 74 million Americans, many of whom, personally, I believe are beyond reason and are in a kind of a historic self-preservation frenzy that is not a complete, accurate truth of the American story.
How do you, as a congressperson, as a man who sat in those seats, you could have been there last week. How does in the bipartisan culture, how do you look at that kind of extreme polarization as being intelligent or worthy of re-election? Or what would you do to those congresspersons? How do we handle those kind of senators? Should they be censored? Should they be fired? How do we handle that kind of energy? Because it's anti-American. It appears to millions of us, hundreds of millions of us, that it's anti-American. If you were there, what would you say? What would you do?
It might be too early for me to offer the words of reconciliation that they will need to recover. What I can share with you is that after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, the country under President Johnson and then President Ulysses S. Grant went through a period of reconstruction. And at the very beginning of that reconstruction, rather than having large trials of treason, the country used the power of the presidency to grant amnesty, to allow states to come back into the Union, to forgive them on the terms of you must pass the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. In other words, it wasn't just a feeling of we just need to embrace each other. I'm watching that on the floor of the Congress as we discuss, or they discuss, the second impeachment of this president. Let's move on. Let's have unity. The terms of unity include reconstruction, and in those terms include amendments to the Constitution so that we don't find ourselves in this place ever again. And it is from that flows the forgiveness, from that flows the redemption and the rehabilitation. There was a soldier in the American Civil War who whose father came to Abraham Lincoln, and Abraham Lincoln handled this gentleman with extreme mercy. His father came to him and he said, "Mr. President, my son is going to be hung shortly for treason or for abandoning the troops in the middle of a battle." And Abraham Lincoln, in his graciousness, said, "Did your son sign up for the fight?" And his father said, "Yes, my son is dedicated to the Union, Mr. President." Abraham Lincoln said, "Well, my position is his heart was in the right place, even if his legs decided to go in another. Let the boy be pardoned." And Abraham Lincoln pardoned him. So Abraham Lincoln saw some value in a man who abandoned his colleagues in battle. Although his heart was in the right place, his legs weren't. And so I can look at some of my colleagues and say, I believe that your heart may be in the right place, but clearly your mind and your legs aren't. And I'm willing to give your legs and your mind a chance to catch up to what you truly know to be true and believe.
That's good for the whole nation. That's great for the whole nation right now. I think it was Voltaire who said, those who are persuaded to believe absurdities can be persuaded to commit atrocities. There's so much absurdity in the thinking of the country right now, and media feeds it. The internet is wild and unchecked, and that's a whole nother monster that we're trying to deal with, because I think the number one paranoia, the number one pandemic in the country that's not physical is distrust, confusion, and conspiracy ethics. The idea of conspiring to hurt or harm something, or even to hear something that is unhealthy. I don't know how we'll deal with that. It's going to take a lot of time to clear it out and clean it out, because people are believing things that are just absolutely untrue, but they're blown out of proportion, amplified and magnified. And when the media says it, whatever particular media outlet you're using, it sounds adequate. It sounds authoritative. So we need to rethink how we receive information over the information highway or lie way right now, and use our spirit to discern truth, not just hearing with your ear, but hearing with your heart, and not just your hurts.
I think that's right, Bishop. I think we're also consistent with that. We're going to have to leave some room for the Saul to Paul conversion experience. Yeah. My father was at the bedside of Hubert Humphrey when a few days before he died, and my dad asked him the question, "You've had decades in politics, how do you sum it up?" And Hubert Humphrey said, "Jesse, we've got to forgive each other, we've got to redeem each other, and we got to move on. If I'd have known what I'm saying now, had I said it 5 decades ago, I now know that the contribution I would have made to the world would have been fundamentally different. That's Hubert Humphrey in the hospital at his deathbed. My father went to visit at his request George Wallace, and he was extremely apologetic. Spent time with Daddy King. He didn't want to be remembered for standing in a schoolhouse door. When he looked at the sum total of his life and had to separate the political battles and the rhetoric from who he would be before he meets his maker, he made an argument that if I could have rewritten this story, I might have not pandered to the crowd. I might have said it differently. And when we know who Lyndon Johnson was before he was president, and then to see him with the 64 Civil Rights Act and the 65 Voting Rights Act and the public accommodations legislation and welcoming Dr. King to the White House and ushering in the civil rights movement. Still, the hallmark of the entire civil rights movement comes from an arch segregationist named Lyndon Johnson, who had to usher it through the House and the Senate to get it to his desk. Then all of us have the power. If they can change,
Any of us can.
we have the power to change.
Nice.
We have to leave room for that. The great gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, is at the March on Washington in 1963. And Dr. King gives the most poignant political speech in American history. He says, America has issued us a bad check. It has come back to all of us marked insufficient funds. But we refuse to believe that the great vault of this nation's opportunity is bankrupt. We refuse to believe that. That is the essence of his speech. In fact, I call that, the more I think about it, Bishop Pearson and Pastor, I consider that to be the Unitarian part of the speech, what we must do right now. And then the gospel singer, Mahalia Jackson, from the African-American religious tradition, she hollers out in the crowd, and it's very audible. Tell them about the dream, Dr. King. And then he moves into the African-American theological tradition about his little children and everybody's little children and our getting along and our holding hands. And he moves into the dramatic conclusion, but the substance of his speech we have ignored. And so whether it is at the beginning of the coronavirus, they told us there was no money to raise the minimum wage or to provide every American with health care or to solve our climate crisis. Somehow, $1 trillion showed up to find masks and respirators, and money that did not exist then suddenly existed, that we have been arguing about is always there. So now where's all this money coming from that we say we don't have before the dream, and you leave us dreaming about it afterward, when before the pandemic, the truth of the matter is there was resources to build hospitals, to put nurses on a level playing field, to provide more doctors, and to relieve students of their student loan debts so that they might go to medical school, and we would have even more doctors to address domestic as well as global health crises. I would argue, Reverend, that this is a challenge not to our knowledge or our reason, but to our political will to do what we know is just and right for people. And I think that's what Dr. King was appealing to. I know that's what my father dedicated his life to, and I look forward to making and doing whatever I can to continue that part of our nation's struggle.
Oh, that's fantastic.
Thank you for joining us. For 100 years, All Souls in Tulsa has been a beacon of this free faith. We offer our services and programs freely online for all those who are interested. You can help us to do this by making a one-time gift today or a reoccurring pledge. We really appreciate you joining us and being a part of helping us make All Souls in Tulsa what it is. Thank you.